It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. According to unofficial reports, Venezuela's National Electoral Council is about to proceed with the next steps in the process of organizing a recall referendum against President Nicolas Maduro. The opposition says a recall referendum could take place as soon as October of this year. Government supporters, however, doubt whether the lengthy process can be completed before the end of this year. Meanwhile, the Maduro government recently introduced a new production and supply program for basic staples in order to combat Venezuela's rampant inflation and shortages. With us to talk about all of these issues and much more is our own Gregory Wilpert. He lived in Venezuela from 2000 to 2008 and is the author of the book, Changing Venezuela by Taking Power. He joins us today from Constance, Germany. Thanks so much for joining us, Greg.
Thank you.
So, Greg, regarding this recall referendum, the opposition is saying that the National Electoral Council is intentionally delaying the process, so much so that the OAS Secretary General last week, Luis Almagro, recently introduced measures to oust Venezuela, expel it from the OAS for violating the OAS Democratic Charter. What's really going on? What's the CNE saying?
Well, it's counting the first step of the signatures that were collected last month. That is, the opposition submitted something like it claimed to submit something like 1.8 million signatures. So far, it seems they've verified the validity of 1.3 million of those, although they also need to cross-check them still against the fingerprint scans. And so that's really the next phase. They need to verify against the fingerprints 200,000, and if that happens, then they will have they will initiate the next step, which is to collect 20% of voters' signatures, or 4 million signatures, within something like 5 days. And that will take a while to initiate that process and to also verify all those 4 million signatures. And then once that happens, there might be a recall referendum.
And this 200,000 verifications that they are doing, is that because there's some doubt about them, or is this a part of the process?
It's a part of the process. Back in 2004, when the opposition tried to, or when it actually did organize a recall referendum against President Chavez, they did not have a clear process or rules in place, and so it was kind of invented as it went along. And then in 2007, the National Electoral Council published a pretty lengthy guideline as to exactly how recall referenda should be organized, and that includes the verification against fingerprints, that is, verifying the fingerprints of 200,000 of those in order to initiate the process. That is, they didn't want anybody to just go ahead and initiate a recall referendum against the president. Rather, you had to have at least 1% of registered voters initiate the process, and that's really what this is all about.
Now, Greg, the opposition is very, very intent on making sure that this recall referendum takes place before January 10th, because as it happens, that date will be the date. If they don't get this measure through, then even if there was a recall referendum on the president, then the vice president simply takes over. From what I understand. Explain the process, and do you think there will be a recall referendum on President Maduro?
Yes, if the president gets removed in the last 2 years of his office, whether it's by a recall referendum or any other reason, whether he's impeached or were to die or something like that, then the Constitution establishes that the vice president takes over. So that deadline is January 10th, as you mentioned. And it's still an open question whether or not the entire process that I described earlier of collecting the signatures, verifying the signatures, organizing a referendum, all of that can happen before that date. That is, according to the CNE's own guidelines, the maximum time needed for all of that entire process would take beyond January 10th. Now, that doesn't to say that the CNE, the National Electoral Council, couldn't hurry things up and actually organize everything before January 10th, but they might not. We don't really know. That's the big question, and that's what the opposition is very nervous about and is organizing demonstrations on a regular basis to put pressure on the Electoral Council to hurry up so that they can actually have that vote before January 10th. But we really don't know. The Chavistas, that is the government supporters, are saying that it probably won't happen, and the opposition, like I said, is very intent on making sure it does happen because they don't want to see the vice president, Aristoburu Asturias, to take over for the last 2 years of Maduro's term.
Now, the President Maduro is actually having not very much support from the general public. His ratings are at 30% or so. Now, we do know that the opposition controls the General Assembly, that's a national council in Venezuela, and the question here is, where is the National Electoral Council itself? Are these basically supporters of Maduro, or is it an objective institution?
Well, the Constitution establishes that the Electoral Council is set up by the National Assembly, but the opposition gets to appoint some of the members. That is, it's a total of 5 people, and they essentially got to name, that is, the government named 3 of them, and the opposition got to name 2 of them because they were put into place when the Chavistas had a majority in the National Assembly. If they were to create a new National Assembly now, the ratio would probably be the other way around. So in other words, the majority of the people in the Electoral Council were appointed by supporters of the current government, basically.
Now, the discontent on the part of the Venezuelans at this time has a lot to do with the food shortages and the inflation they're experiencing. So have the lines gotten any shorter in terms of accessing basic food and supplies? And how is this local supply and production committees that you mentioned that Maduro just introduced, how are they going to work, and are they having any impact yet?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, they were introduced only relatively recently, so it's a little bit difficult to say, but the government is in a better position than it was just a month ago for a variety of reasons. For one thing, the price of oil has been inching upwards, which makes more funds available for imports. That was a major problem, and one of the main causes of the shortages is that they simply didn't import enough, or didn't have enough money, enough dollars to import food as they did before. And so that's coming back. In other words, the government is having more money available now that the price of oil is inching up slowly. And the other factor is that the government also has introduced a floating exchange rate that's not completely freely floating, but it has, of the 2 official exchange rates that it has, one which is 10 bolivars to the dollar, and another is kind of floating and has reached 500 bolivars to the dollar. And what that has caused is it's caused the black market rate to stabilize. And that's really an important achievement for the government, because one of the causes of inflation and also of the shortages was that there was an increasing gap between the official exchange rates and the black market exchange rate, which was causing people to profit or giving people tremendous incentive to profit off of that differential. Now that differential is still there, and so that's why you still have inflation and you still have shortages, but the incentive isn't as strong as it used to be. And so that's a major advantage for the government. And then on top of it all, it's introducing these local production and supply committees, which are basically kind of a grassroots organization to produce foods anywhere that people can in their backyards, and to also participate in the distribution of foods that are provided by the government in order to kind of do an end run around private suppliers and private producers who have been trying to game the system and make massive profits off of that, and have also been contributing essentially to shortages and inflation. And so, all these factors combined, I think, will improve the situation. Although I don't think it's enough, really, because the incentives, the basic incentive of the black markets, is still there.
And I guess one question that is in everyone's mind is, why did it take the government so long to implement this limitation on the exchange controls, which has been causing all these problems in the black market and instability. And it's gotten so far out there, and it could have been curtailed earlier. Why didn't they do that?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's actually a bit of a mystery, I think, for many people on all sides. I would be just speculating as well, but I think part of the problem is that you have different competing interests within the government, some of whom are urging President Maduro to take a more radical course, to nationalize all of domestic food production and to completely nationalize the whole process of imports. And others who are saying that he needs to accommodate the economy more towards the fact that Venezuela is in a capitalist global economy and therefore has to have some kind of a floating exchange rate in order to take that into account. And Maduro was stuck in between these two positions. That is, the more kind of accommodating position of taking the global economy into account, essentially, and the more radical position of simply nationalizing the whole thing. And he has been quite indecisive as a result, because he didn't decide one way or the other. I think if Chavez had been in office, he would have probably made a more decisive decision one way or the other much sooner. Maduro seems to be trying to inch towards a solution. That's why it's still not there exactly where I think, at least, the solution is, which is to take into account the fact that Venezuela exists in a global market economy, at least to some extent. That has to be recognized, and therefore the exchange rate has to be adapted to that. But he's slowly moving in that direction, it would seem, right now.
All right, Greg, I thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll keep an eye on this, as I'm sure you will.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.